This final video for the chapter dealing with Congress will deal with the congressional lawmaking process primarily. As we look at Congress, we need to understand that Congress is called the national legislature. And the national legislature, any legislature, is a body of people that make laws for a geographic region. So as we look at Congress, Congress is simply the national legislature, the group of people who make laws for the United States. There are state legislatures that make laws for states. So a lot of counties have county commissions which make laws for the county. Cities have, city councils. These are also considered legislatures of a sort because they make laws or rules that the citizens of a certain area have to abide by. And when we look, and this video is going to take a really quick look at how the legislative process in Congress works. I want all of us to think back to when we were younger and we were watching cartoons on Saturday morning and we saw the Schoolhouse Rock video with Bill sitting on Capitol Hill. He's so alone. He's afraid he's never going to make it to become a law. If you get the opportunity, watch that video because that video is very accurate in a very elementary way when describing the lawmaking process. We're going to go into a little bit more detail than Schoolhouse Rock did. A couple of things you need to keep in mind before we get into walking through the process of how a bill becomes a law. You must understand that in order for a bill to become a law, it must go through both the House of Representatives and the Senate in the exact same format before the President can do anything with it. In addition, the bill must go through the House of Representatives and the Senate and all the way through the presidential process within 1 year. If a bill doesn't make it all the way through the House and through the Senate and all the way through presidential action within a year, that bill dies, and in order for that bill to be reconsidered the next year, it has to go all the way back to the beginning of the process. Also want you to understand that anybody can suggest an idea for a bill. I can come up with an idea for a bill. A police officer can come up with an idea for a bill. The President cannot come up with an idea for a bill. But an idea is nothing but that. It's a suggestion. Hey, this would be a great issue to write a bill about. The only individuals that can introduce a bill into Congress is a member of Congress. As a matter of fact, in order for the House of Representatives to consider a bill, it has to be introduced by a member of the House of Representatives. A U.S. Senator cannot introduce a bill into the U.S. House of Representatives. A member of the United States House of Representatives cannot introduce a bill into the Senate. So no matter how good my idea is as President, that bill will never get to my desk for signature unless somebody in the House and somebody in the Senate introduces it. And kind of what we're talking about today in modern-day news coverage. We're talking about Obamacare. We're talking about the health care legislation that we call Obamacare. It really, if you want to think about it, it's really not Obamacare. He was only one person. And if he wanted health care legislation, but nobody in the House and nobody in the Senate wanted it, nothing would happen to it. So in order for a bill to be entered into Congress, it has to be introduced into the House by a member of the House and into the Senate by a member of the Senate. And remember, a bill must go through both of those houses before the President can consider it. And the final thing about the lawmaking process that I want you to know up front is that the lawmaking process is a biased process. Before a bill ever gets into Congress, there's a foregone conclusion that it's probably going to fail. Our legislative process has purposely been created in a way that is difficult. And the reason that our lawmaking process is so biased is because when Congress passes a law and the President signs it, there's very little that can be done by the citizens unless they take some case to the U.S. Supreme Court. So we only want the best of the best in the cases of laws to be passed. If an idea could easily be introduced into Congress and become law, then we would have some pretty crazy laws. much more crazy than the ones that we currently have. So keep those four things in mind as we're going through this process in explaining how a bill becomes a law. This flow chart that we show on the screen here shows the process by which a bill becomes a law. And you'll notice there's four different colors on here. You have the blue that deals with what happens to a law in the House of Representatives. You have the red, which deals with what happens to a law or a bill in the United States Senate. The green will show you what happens when the House and the Senate work together on a bill. And then, of course, the yellow shows what would happen when the President deals with a piece of legislation. This flow chart is detailed enough to show you how detailed the process is, but yet not too detailed to bog us down into a lot of the minor intricacies of a bill becoming a law. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by looking at this flow chart, and I want you to notice that every step in this flow chart has but one arrow, and every one of these arrows shows the bill moving on to the next step in the process. That is really a fallacy. It's not accurate. If we truly wanted to make this flow chart demonstrate what happens to a bill when it's introduced into Congress, for every one of those arrows that point the bill forward to the next step in the process, there would be 2 or 3 arrows or 2 or 3 red X's that we could pop up that would show a bill dying. At any step in this process, a bill can be killed. And in many cases, a bill can be killed because one person wants to kill that piece of legislation. So this goes back to the idea that I talked about earlier about this legislative process being a biased process against passage. Now, in describing this process of a bill becoming a law, I am going to focus just on what happens to a bill when it is introduced into the House of Representatives. I'm going to do that because the process by which a bill goes through the Senate is very similar. But you do need to understand that they're two separate processes. And a bill can be introduced into the House first and work its way through the House, and then get introduced to the Senate and work its way through the Senate. Or it can be introduced into the Senate first, or it can be introduced into both houses simultaneously. But you have to understand that it's two separate processes. And we go back to the beginning of this chapter when I talked about the fact that the rules of Congress, the day-to-day rules of Congress, are created by the individual House. The House of Representatives makes its own rules. The U.S. Senate makes its own rules. And this can be seen when we look at how a bill becomes a law in the House process and how a bill becomes a law in the Senate process. If you'll notice, the House of Representatives basically has 6 initial steps. The Senate only has 5 initial steps. And that's because the Senate has chosen to do their process without a Rules Committee. The House chooses to use a Rules Committee. That's just basically because the House has more people and they think they need that extra step in the process, whereas the Senate does not. Now, let's assume that a bill is introduced into the House of Representatives. I, as a member of the House of Representatives, is going to give that bill basically to the Speaker of the United States House. Now, the Speaker will be the first person who has a decision to make about this piece of legislation. The Speaker can look at that piece of legislation and assign it to a committee or refer it to the appropriate committee. If a bill that he gets or she gets deals with soybeans, he gets to make the decision of, am I going to send this bill to the Agriculture Committee? He could do that, and the bill continues on the process. Or the Speaker of the House could simply say, I'm not going to refer this legislation to committee. He just simply sets it on his desk, and he doesn't have to give a reason why he's setting it on his desk. He'll just simply say, we don't have time to deal with this bill now, and it'll sit on his desk, and maybe he never gets time to get back to it. The bill dies. Because one person the Speaker of the House said, I don't want this bill to move on, it could die. Now, if the Speaker does move this bill on to the Agriculture Committee, for example, it goes to the Agriculture Committee chair. And the Agriculture Committee chair looks at this bill and makes the same decision the Speaker made. Do I want to move this bill forward to the subcommittee that deals with the topic of this piece of legislation, or do I want to leave this bill on my desk? If the chair of the committee leaves it on his desk, he or she could simply leave it there until the end of the session and the bill dies. But if a bill is lucky enough to go to the subcommittee, the subcommittee chairman then gets the piece of legislation, and the subcommittee chairman, again, makes the same decision. Do I want the subcommittee to work on this piece of legislation? And if he does, he assigns it, he puts it on the docket or the agenda for that subcommittee to start working on it. If that subcommittee chairman does not want the subcommittee to deal with this piece of legislation, he or she can simply set it on her desk, his or her desk, and leave it there until the end of the session and the bill dies. Now, if a bill is to make it to subcommittee and make it on the agenda of the subcommittee, this is where the real work on a piece of legislation takes place. Remember, we said the vast majority of all work in Congress is done at the committee or subcommittee level? There's a lot of work done at the subcommittee level because that's where the real experts on the topics are. And when a subcommittee is working on a piece of legislation, that process is called markup. When subcommittees are rewriting or fixing a piece of legislation, making a piece of legislation as strong as possible, it's called markup. They're marking out pieces of of that legislation. They're writing pieces, inserting pieces, moving pieces around. It's kind of like when you are rewriting a paper for an English class. You mark it up. During this markup process, the subcommittee will hear from experts. They'll hear from each other, members of Congress, they're experts, but they'll also bring in experts from the field. They might bring in, the president of some company that makes a certain kind of agricultural product, or they might bring in scientists that do research into that certain type of agricultural process. Most of the work is done at the subcommittee level. Now, once the subcommittee is done marking it up and they think they have a really good piece of legislation, then the chairman of that subcommittee has another decision to make. Do I want this bill that the subcommittee just wrote? Do we want this piece of legislation to be voted on by the subcommittee? And if he wants that piece of legislation to be voted on by the subcommittee, he schedules a vote on it, and the members of the subcommittee get to vote, yes, we want this bill, or no, we don't. And if a majority of the people in the subcommittee say, yes, we want this bill, then that bill is sent back to the original committee it started with. If a majority of the people on the subcommittee say no, the bill dies. But remember, the chairman of the subcommittee could decide never to schedule a debate on this piece of legislation. He could set it on his or her desk, and as I said before, the bill could die at subcommittee level. But let's just assume that the bill gets passed by the subcommittee. It goes back to the original committee. The chairman of that original committee will decide whether he wants to schedule that piece of legislation for debate at the committee level. That committee chairman, again, could either leave that piece of legislation set on his or her desk, or he or she could schedule it for debate at the committee level. The committee debates it. The committee, makes some decisions about it. Then the committee chairman decides, do I want to schedule this for a final vote at the committee level, or do I want to set it on my desk? If he schedules it for a final vote at the committee level, and a majority of the people in the committee say we want this bill to pass, then the bill moves on to the Rules Committee. If a majority of the people on the committee say no to this piece of legislation, the bill dies. If the bill makes it to the Rules Committee, the same exact process happens. The chairman of the Rules Committee decides, when are we going to debate this? How long are we going to debate this? And then the members of the Rules Committee get to vote yes or no on that piece of legislation. If they vote no on the piece of legislation, it dies. If they vote yes on the piece of legislation, then it moves on to the Speaker's house, the Speaker's office again. And then at that time, the Speaker gets to decide, are we going to allow the full 435 members of the House of Representatives to deal with this piece of legislation? And if the Speaker wants the full House to deal with it, he schedules time for the debate, he schedules the time for the vote, and then after the House of Representatives has done its debate and its floor action, then the House of Representatives is given the chance to vote yes or no on this piece of legislation. And if a majority of the people vote yes on this piece of legislation, the bill has passed the House. If a majority of the people in the House has voted no on this piece of legislation, it dies. Now, just because your piece of legislation has made it through the House of Representatives, only about a third of the job is done. Because even though your bill makes it through the House of Representatives, it has to go through a very similar process in the United States Senate. And keep in mind that any one of these steps in the United States Senate could kill this piece of legislation. And if it dies at one of these steps in the Senate process, the bill is dead, and it never has the opportunity to become a law. At this point, let's make the assumption that a bill has passed through the House and has passed through the Senate. The chances that the bill that has passed through the House dealing with soybeans is going to be exactly the same as the bill that's passed through the Senate dealing with soybeans is pretty slim. So probably what we're going to have is we're going to have a bill that the United States House of Representatives has passed dealing with soybeans, and maybe that bill calls for $10 million in research into soybean issues. Then the bill in the United States Senate might say that we want $20 million in research into soybean issues. Well, we have two different bills. Which bill do we get to send to the President? Neither of them. Because as we remember back to the beginning of this discussion about the lawmaking process, before the President can deal with a bill, it has to pass through the House and pass through the Senate in the exact same format. So what happens if we have a soybean bill in the House that calls for $10 million in research funds and the soybean bill from the Senate calls for 20, we will create what's called a conference committee, and that's in green. And a conference committee is simply members of the United States House that worked on the soybean legislation and members of the United States Senate that worked on the soybean legislation coming together and working out the differences. And probably what we would assume would happen is since the House wanted $10 million in research money and the Senate wanted $20 million in research money, they would compromise and maybe they'd say $15 million in research money. They would fix all of the differences in the bills so that the conference committee would create one soybean bill. But since the conference committee has basically created a new bill that's different than the House bill and the Senate bill, what happens is the new bill that's passed through the conference committee has to be sent back to the House for vote and sent back to the Senate for a vote. It goes through basically the same process at the House and the Senate, but it goes through those steps much quicker. Once the House of Representatives has passed that bill that came out of conference committee, and the Senate has passed the bill that's come out of the conference committee, then both houses have passed the same piece of legislation, and we call that bill an enrolled bill, and an enrolled bill is ready to go to the President's desk for presidential action. The actions that the President can take with an enrolled bill that Congress has sent to him is going to be the topic of discussion for next week. Next week we're going to take a look at what the President's job is, and one of the first things we'll look at is what the President can do with a piece of legislation once it makes it to his desk. Let's assume that a bill has made it all the way through the lawmaking process and it has actually become a law and the President has signed it. Just because Congress has passed a law creating a program doesn't necessarily mean that that program is actually going to be put into action. Because when we look at the process that we just looked at, we call that process the authorization process. Congress has passed a law giving permission for something to happen. Now, just because Congress has given permission for something to happen doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen, because in order for a new program that Congress creates to be put into action, you need money. And let me give you an example. My daughter could come to me and say, "Hey, Dad, do I have your permission to buy a Lamborghini?" And I could say, "Yes, you have permission to buy the Lamborghini." But unless my daughter has the money to buy the Lamborghini, my permission to purchase it means absolutely nothing. So since I moved here to Southeast Missouri, I have always thought about the fact that September, October, and November must be very difficult months for Chicago Cubs baseball fans, because they're never in the World Series, they never have anything to celebrate, and life must be really difficult for them. So I've always said, hey, I think we should create a Chicago Cubs mental health counseling program. Now, I could go to Joanne Emerson and convince her to help me get a piece of legislation passed that creates the Chicago Cubs fan counseling service. And 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 members of the Senate could vote, yes, we authorize you to create this program. And I get all excited because I have this new program. But unless Congress gives me money to hire doctors and to rent space and to do those kinds of things, I can't provide any services. So the process that Congress goes through is actually two different processes. There is the authorization process, which is basically giving these programs permission to exist. And then there's appropriations process, which is the process by which Congress looks at the money they have every year and they decide how much money is going to go to each program. And if everybody in Congress thinks it's a great idea to have a mental health counseling program for Chicago Cubs fans, but there's no money available for that program, there's no way that I can provide that service. And even though the service has been authorized to exist, it's no good because it hasn't been appropriated. There are two different processes. There's the appropriations process and then the authorization process. They look very similar. They have, different steps of the process they have to go through. The appropriations bill, which we basically call the budget, goes to the president's desk for signature. But while they're very similar, they're two separate processes. Make sure you understand the difference between the authorization process and the appropriations process. After Congress has gone all through the process of authorizing a program to exist and then appropriating money for that program to exist, a lot of people think that Congress cares nothing else about that piece of legislation. Because we must remember that when a bill is passed, when a bill becomes a law, Congress doesn't carry out that law. Congress passes that law on to the president, who passes it on to bureaucrats to carry out the law. And when we talk about bureaucrats being the ones that carry out the laws, they're doing that without the president looking right over their shoulder or with Congress looking right over their shoulder. Remember, bureaucrats have a lot of flexibility in carrying out laws. So a lot of people would assume then that bureaucrats can do whatever they want to. It's not true, because members of Congress do, in fact, care about how a piece of legislation is carried out. And the process by which Congress ensures that laws are being carried out properly is called oversight. It's a big job of Congress. In addition to writing laws, Congress oversees the implementation of those laws. And Congress conducts their oversight process in one of two ways. They will either do site visits, they'll go to a location where some federal law is being carried out, and they'll watch and see how it's being carried out. And they'll make sure that the bureaucrats are carrying that law out in a way that's consistent with what Congress was thinking when they passed the law. The other way Congress will conduct oversight is by having hearings. They will call experts in They will call the bureaucrats into Congress and ask the bureaucrats that are in charge of carrying out, tobacco regulation policy or military policy. They'll call them into Congress, and members of Congress will ask them questions. And they'll make sure that these bureaucrats are carrying out the laws the way they're supposed to. If Congress finds out that these bureaucrats are not carrying out the laws the way that they expect them to, Congress can rewrite a law, being very specific and telling them how they should carry out the law. Or Congress can say, hey, we're going to change the budget. Next year when we write a budget, you don't want to do it our way, we're not going to appropriate for your program. So Congress has some control over how a bill is implemented after it leaves Congress through both the site visit process, committee hearing process, and the major tool that they use to change the way bureaucrats act is the budget. They'll give more or less money to the bureaucrats depending on whether or not they're carrying out the laws the way Congress intended them to or not. So the two major jobs of Congress, legislative process is broken down into the authorization process and the appropriations process, and then the second major job of Congress is overseeing the implementation of the laws that they've passed. The very first thing we're going to look at next chapter when we talk about the presidency is we're going to look at what the president can do when Congress has sent him a bill.